Welcome, everybody, to Humanities 205, Civilization and Culture from the medieval period up to the present day. My name is, as you can see on the screen, I am Professor Jeff Winkle, and I am a professor here in the Humanities Department at GRCC, which is part of the Language and Thought, which you can find on the third floor of RJF Hall, formerly the main building. And in this video, I want to kind of walk us through just some of the basics of the course, especially if you're new to online learning, and walk through the syllabus, talk about expectations, grading, readings, all the kind of the basic nuts and bolts of any course, and then talk a little bit about, broadly speaking, kind of the what we're going to cover over the next several weeks together. And as always, don't hesitate to drop me a line, shoot me an email if any of this is unclear. If you're having issues with anything, just let me know. So like I said, my name is Jeff Winkle. I have a kind of a wide background in the humanities. My specific expertise is in ancient Greece and Rome, literature, languages, religion, mythology. But I am a deep lover of art and history and philosophy and religion across the centuries. And we're going to look at a lot of those things across the centuries from roughly about 1300 AD up to the present day, and we'll see how we do. Let's see here. Yes, so this course is what we call an asynchronous course. So we will not be having regular meetings, via Google Meets or Zoom or anything like that. What you'll find on the course Blackboard site is a folder for each week. And in that week are a number of tasks that I'm asking you to complete, readings, quizzes. We'll be watching some films, some documentaries along the way, and those will usually include a forum discussion response that I'll ask you to upload. And so what I ask you to do is to open a week's folder, and I ask you to complete that work by midnight or 11:59 p.m. specifically on Sunday. The Sunday before the next week's folder opens up. So the textbook that I have for the class is this one right here on the right, Culture and Values. And it's the same book that I use for the 204 sequence. So the 204 sequence takes us from antiquity up to about the medieval era. And then 205 kind of picks up the story at the medieval era to the present day. And so in terms of readings, we're going to kind of jump in kind of halfway through this book. As the book is laid out chronologically. I think it's chapter 10 that I ask you to start this. So a lot of what we'll be talking about fairly early on is the Italian Renaissance, which will involve a discussion of this very famous statue here on the cover. This is, maybe some of you recognize it. This is the famous David sculpture by Michelangelo Buonarroti, the man from Florence who is sometimes synonymous with the Italian Renaissance. So usually each week I'll have you to do kind of one or two readings, and each reading will come with a quiz attached to it. I'll say more about that when we walk through the syllabus. These are, again, I just ask you to do the reading and take the quiz before the end of the week. These are timed quizzes just to keep you honest and to prevent kind of frantic book flipping to find the answer. But again, I'm not out to trick you. I make these quizzes along the lines that if you've done a decent job of reading the chapters, you should not have any issues with those particular quizzes. So let's take a peek at the syllabus here. And again, you can find the syllabus under its own link on the course Blackboard site. Up at the top here, you can see my name, Dr. Jeff Winkle. Here's my email address. Just note the spelling of Jeffrey. It's Jeff R-E-Y instead of E-R-Y as you sometimes will see. I've not received emails from students because they misspell my name, so just take a note of that. My office is in 351 on the third floor of RJF Hall. I'd love to meet you in person if you want to stop by and talk about a paper or an assignment or as the midterm or the final approaches. Please just let me know, and we'll make an appointment. So as I have the course description. So this course examines the integrated Western humanities from the medieval period up to the present era, while exploring the interrelationships of literature, philosophy, religion, the visual arts, and performing arts. Concerned not only becoming familiar with works from prescribed time periods, learners will also develop ways to critically appreciate and situate such human thoughts and expressions within the context of their counterparts as discovered in contemporary society, which is just kind of a academic-ease way of saying we're going to be looking at a lot of literature, we're going to look at a lot of art, We're going to look at religion. We're going to look at philosophical works. We're going to look at satire. We're going to look at military history. Looking at the kind of most of what we call the Western humanities. So largely kind of centered in Europe, and as things kind of move their way west towards America, that would be our focus. Though we'd be kind of dipping our toes into a number of other areas as well. The only text I've ordered for this class is that culture and values text. So please get that before long, because we're going to jump in with both feet. Grading breakdown. So the course includes a total of 1,000 possible points. And I grade, you can see in the top right here, on a fairly straight scale, 95% to 100% A, 90% to kind of just below 95% A minus and such. So keep this in mind. This will be kind of the rubric I'll be used to give assigning your final grade. And kind of an even breakdown between these things. Attendance and participation. The way attendance is graded in a class like this is just your timely completion of the tasks. And if you're getting your stuff in, finishing it, by the end of each week, that will give you 200 points at the end of the class. There'll be reading quizzes. Usually every week there'll be some form of a reading quiz. Just a note on that. So these will be quizzes. Again, you'll find it in the assignments folder on the course Blackboard site. You do the reading and you open the quiz, and they are timed. And so usually a lot of the quizzes are, say, 10 questions, and I'll give you 15 minutes to complete them, which I think you'll find is plenty of time. You can attempt quizzes twice, but just know that the software will average the grades of your 2 attempts. And so once you take a quiz, it should show you which questions you got wrong. It won't give you the right answer, but it'll tell you which ones you got wrong. And you can use that knowledge to take the quiz again and up your score. And of course, if you ace it your first time through, there's no need to take it a second time. We'll have kind of 2 formal tests in this class, a midterm and a final, and these will be, of course, as per an asynchronous online class. These will be take home. We'll devote, like for the midterm, I'll devote a week to it, and I'll give you questions. The midterm, I like to give kind of essay-based midterms and finals. So the idea is that these reading quizzes, they kind of take care of the who, what, where, when kind of questions from the readings. And then the midterm and the final are more analytic. I'll give you kind of a broad essay questions, or I'll give you, say, a thesis, an argument, and I'll ask you either defend it or argue against it, defend or refute it. And then you do that by using very specific evidence from the stuff that you've read and from course lectures and from films or whatever. Everything is fair game on these kinds of things. And I will often give you a kind of a choice of essays, do 2 out of 3 or 2 out of 4. But we'll talk more about that as we get closer. There'll be one kind of formal course paper. I'll talk more about this. I don't want to overwhelm you with detail right now at the beginning, but you will be responsible for one kind of analytic, kind of formal paper, which will be due the very last week of class. So plenty of time to get ready for that and to talk about that. And you can see all of these things are worth 200 points apiece, which total up to a potential 1,000 points. The next page of the syllabus, or pages of the syllabus, you can see the course schedule here. I gave you for each week the kind of the basic topic. Again, everything you're going to find that you need to do is going to be under the assignments tab, and there on Blackboard, and you'll find the folders there for each week. So here, but you can always refer to the syllabus. I'll give you the kind of the topic or topics for each week, and then the readings assigned in accordance with them. So a lot of them, so you can see that the assignment here, Cunningham, that's the lead author of our textbook, and so that's how I'm referring to it. So chapter 10 from that Culture and Values book. And that won't be the only book readings we'll be doing. I'll put some, I have them listed as handouts here, but I will, they'll be in the weekly folders as PDFs or a Word document, which you will not be charged for. So have a look at that, and then of course college policies. This is kind of boilerplate that you'll find in every GRCC syllabus, but I will leave it to you to have a look at those things and trust that you've done so. All right, so in this class we're going to be looking at a number of different things: art, music, philosophy, literature, religion, all kind of taking kind of a chronological historical look from roughly about, like I said, about 1300 AD over the next 7+ hundred years up to the current day. And so my philosophy of teaching is that I don't think it makes much sense for me simply to have you do a reading in the textbook and then me to kind of go through that reading in my lectures. I find that's kind of a pointless exercise. I think that in an online class, the burden of responsibility is in many ways much more on the student to get this stuff done and to be disciplined of getting this stuff done. And so kind of my philosophy is that the chapters that you'll read will cover a lot more detail, maybe not in so much depth, but a lot more detail than I will cover in lectures. And so what I take to be kind of a good use of lecture time is to zero in on 2, 3, or 4 things from that chapter and then take them further. And so we go more in depth into a handful of things rather than try to cover everything that the chapter just did in a kind of less detailed kinds of fashion. So do the chapters. So that part of your education, that part of your learning to kind of cover all of that detail is really on you to do the chapters. And I think I have the same philosophy in my in-person classes as well. But I find that kind of a balance between those two, kind of the broad, detailed chapters, coupled with a much more intense, much more in-depth lecture, makes for a nice kind of combination of pieces. And so kind of throughout, as you might expect from a humanities class, we'll be kind of asking kind of these big questions. Where did we come from? Here we are living in America, which is kind of, it has its kind of principal kind of philosophical and religious heritage, again, broadly speaking, coming from Europe. What does that tell us about us? What about other influences? What about about peoples that don't kind of attach themselves to the Western culture? Is the Western culture for everyone? What do we owe to the past? How do we read? How do we interpret art and music and literature and history and narratives across the centuries? What does this study tell us about the common bond of humanity throughout the centuries? And what do we have in common? Do we have anything in common with the people of the Italian or the Northern Renaissance, or from the fringes of Europe, or in North Africa and the Middle East? Are there things that tie us all together as humans, no matter what our religious or ethnic, educational background is? What struggles and triumphs are at the heart of the human experience? So just kind of briefly speaking, kind of where we're going. When we're going to start in the so-called medieval period, what we're really dealing with in Europe, and you can see North Africa and also the Middle East over here, is the fragmenting of what was once a unified Roman Empire. It's starting to break down into smaller states, smaller quote-unquote empires, kind of local fiefdoms, and it's starting to break up and kind of give us a kind of a sense of a preview of what will ultimately become modern Europe, the modern Middle East, the modern states of North Africa. And so the Roman Empire lasted a long time, beginning 753 BCE, all the way till, and some people mark it as 1453 CE or AD, which is when Constantinople, right about here, falls to the Ottoman Turks, and kind of spelling the end of any last kind of whiff of what was ancient Rome, although many would argue that Rome had been gone and decimated long before that. But yeah, so we're kind of moving towards a Europe and North Africa that kind of looks like this. It's starting to break down into kind of smaller kingdoms, and people are starting to more kind of organize themselves around language, which again makes kind of common sense. Language is tied to ethnicity. And so, the French and the Spanish and the Italian and the Hungarian and the Polish and the German, the English and the Irish and the Scottish and the Danish, they're all starting to kind of, in some ways, kind of circle the wagons around their own culture. And, the Roman Empire and the Byzantine Empire are starting to fragment and shrink and fall apart. And so, the medieval period, which we're going to kind of jump in, mostly kind of here at what we call the late Middle Ages, roughly 500 to 1000 AD, the so-called Dark Ages, although if you ask a medieval historian, they hate that term. Dark Ages implies kind of backwardness and ignorance and such. And there was a lot of knowledge lost during this era that needs to be rediscovered. But maybe Dark Ages is a little pejorative. But things start to kind of change, between 1000 and 1500. We're kind of getting this slow rediscovery of ancient Greco-Roman learning. We're a rediscovery of architectural techniques and art techniques, and it's starting to kind of bubble up and come alive, and it kind of culminates in the century. We're really going to start with the 14th century AD, the 1300s, which our text calls this era of transition, which kind of moves us out of what we may call the Middle Ages, the medieval period, into something new, into a rebirth, the Renaissance. And the word Renaissance is a French term, which literally means a rebirth. And so, we're going to spend a lot of time talking about the Renaissance, and particularly through the lens of art. We see this famous painting by Raphael called "The School of Athens," which we'll talk about, is on the walls of one of the Pope's apartments in the Vatican. But artists like Botticelli and Raphael and Michelangelo and Donatello and figures like Leonardo da Vinci, who is actually pictured here. It's Plato, but he has the face of Leonardo da Vinci. It's this explosion of rediscovery of knowledge, artistic technique, kind of the flowering of culture, which starts a wave that I would argue that is still kind of affecting the way we kind of understand, art and architecture and beauty to this very day. Religiously speaking, there's a massive earthquake in the 16th century where Martin Luther famously nails his 95 Theses, this challenge to the Catholic Church, on the door of a church in Wittenberg, Germany, and breaks off ultimately from the Catholic Church in what we call the Protestant Reformation, and starting the Great Divide, the split between kind of the Holy Roman Catholic Church and the Protestant Church, which is still massive today and spread around the world. I mean, Catholics too, but Martin Luther sets off an atom bomb in culture. We'll talk about that. The Renaissance period gives way to what we call the Baroque period, which is an era which goes. We're not just talking about Italy here. We're talking throughout Europe, where art becomes very ornate, music becomes more complex. We're pushing towards kind of the era of Mozart and Italian artists like Bernini, who are taking kind of some of these concepts of the Renaissance and their ornateness and their realism to these kind of hyper levels, as it were. And then the era of the Enlightenment, kind of philosophically speaking, 1700 to 1789. This is the era, of course, of the American Revolution and the French Revolution. We have lots of these kind of democratic ideas challenging the right of kings, particularly this notion that kings are given their right to rule by God, and a flowering of democracy and revolutionary ideals, particularly kind of through the American Revolution and the French Revolution, kind of a challenging of kind of religious authority and appealing to reason, scientific reason, as the ultimate arbiter, the ultimate decision maker for what is right and good and proper within a culture. Again, this too sets off a bomb, which we're still feeling the effects of to this very day. In the age of revolution itself, 1776, the beginning of the American Revolution, the French Revolution, which again starts with these ideals of liberty and fraternity and equality, but quickly turns bloody and violent. And you see here the guillotine on the scaffold here, where it becomes kind of this mess of counter-revolutionaries arresting each other and beheading each other. And this kind of ultimately collapses and paves the way for a guy like Napoleon to step in and kind of take over France and put it through another kind of age of empire. America has its own revolution too, and thankfully did not kind of culminate or collapse in kind of a bloody guillotine beheading of rivals. Though of course it comes with its own issues that it has to deal with later on, particularly the issue, of course, of slavery, which descends the country into civil war. Artistically speaking, the Romantic era from kind of roughly 1800 to 1850 AD CE is an era which is kind of a pushback against the Enlightenment, which was very kind of black and white, scientific reason. The Romantic era, particularly in art and in music, pushes back against that and embraces more of kind of a mystical view of the world, kind of embracing the wilds of nature. Here's a romantic painting here. This idea that for all of our reason and for all of our invention and for all of our human skill, we can't compete with nature. Mother Nature will ultimately have her way. She will take it back, as it's sometimes said. And then this is also the era of kind of musicians like Beethoven, with his powerful, deeply kind of mystical and kind of right to the heart type of music. You can't scientifically break down and explain the power of a Beethoven symphony. You simply have to feel it. The Industrial Revolution, taking place roughly at the same time, 1800 to kind of the beginning of World War I. Again, this explosion in technology, and in conjunction with kind of the rise of market capitalism, with all of its wondrousness and all of its challenges and all of its horrors at the same time. And so this is the era that again, the great inventions of the Wright brothers and their flyer, Henry Ford and his assembly line, the invention of the automobile, the airplane, the weapons of war come out of this. And so all the good and the bad and the ugly. And then all of that in many ways, we'll talk about this kind of this with the industrial era, that part of this is great optimism, that kind of this idea that technology is going to save us. It's going to make our lives easier and better. It's going to bring peace. It's going to bring prosperity. And about part of that, of course, is true. This whole era kind of collapses in this horrendous, roughly kind of 30-year period of catastrophic world wars, World War I and of course World War II. Which just leaves the world really, of course, add to that, the horrors of Nazism and the Holocaust. And this staggering stat that more people, humans butchered each other in more numbers in the 20th century. In fact, in just kind of one half of the 20th century, than historians think than all the other centuries of human civilization combined. And so how do you square those things? This rise of enlightenment and philosophy and reason and technology gives way to the butchering horrors of the wars, World War I, World War II, and not to mention all the other wars and holocausts of the 20th century. How do those things get together? How do we square those kinds of things? The Cold War, which again follows on the heels of World War II, rivals between kind of the East and West, particularly the superpowers of the Soviet Union, led by Stalin and Khrushchev and Brezhnev and the like, and America, where the Cold War is not an open hot war between them, but the kind of the building up of nuclear arms on either side and kind of seeing who's going to blink, which most people mark the end of that 1989, which is where the Berlin Wall comes tumbling down in November of that year. A couple of years later, the Soviet Union collapses, which some people mark as kind of the final nail in the coffin. Although some people would argue here in 2022, we're living with another kind of buildup of a Cold War. There's still a rivalry between America and Russia, but probably even more so kind of a building rivalry Cold War going on between America and China, which has emerged as kind of a major power, economic, nuclear, and otherwise. Postmodernism and postmodernism. We're going to be taking a look at kind of art and music and film, particularly from the 1960s to today. Again, we've seen a lot of kind of fragmenting. That kind of the idea of ultimate objective truth and reason has kind of gone out the window, broadly speaking. And again, we're living in a very fragmented society today. And I think the internet and things like social media have just kind of pushed that even further, and kind of pushes us into kind of fragments us into our own little silos of entertainment and information. And again, I think a very worthy question for a humanities class to ask is, where are we going? What's positive about this? What's negative about this? How do we interpret this? How do we read the culture when the culture is so noisy and always in our face? Where can we find quiet? Where can we find truth? Is it possible in this era that we live in? So, I mean, these are questions we can ask kind of throughout every century that we cover in this class. But I think culminating in very, very explicit and necessary questions for today. All right, so that gives us a kind of a look of kind of where we're going. And we'll cover each of these eras in great detail as we go through. Let me know if you have questions.